Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this Q&A with the film The Kings of Mulberry Street. I am Joanne Parsont, Director of Education for California Film Institute and the Family Films Programmer for the Mill Valley Film Festival. It is my great pleasure to welcome our special guests, director and writer Judy Naidoo, and one of the stars of the film, who plays Tiki's mom, Charmaine Chetty, Rizelle Januk. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from, you're both in South Africa right now, correct?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. This film was so much fun. It was so great to be able to include it in the festival. I'm wondering, Judy, if you can start off just by telling us a little bit about your inspiration for writing this story, since you wrote the screenplay as well as directing the film.
So I wrote the story, actually wrote it many years ago. I wrote it in 2006. And I didn't think South African audiences were ready for a film like this. So it just got put on the back burner, and it only got realized, well, as you know, recently, because we released it last year in South Africa and had a really wonderful experience doing that. But the inspiration came from actually my own childhood. I was very much a tomboy growing up. And I never identified myself as either a boy or a girl. I was just a child with a very vivid imagination and a very crazy behavior and wanting to do lots of exciting and adventurous things like a lot of other kids. And so I used my own childhood growing up in the 80s in South Africa, which was a very divided world at the time, because that was apartheid South Africa, where communities live separately of each other. And so I used all of that knowledge of, from my own background to fuel the story and to, a lot of people might not get the subtleties that are in the film, but I think for those who do, or those who know South African history, or, they would get that this was, a world in which communities were separated based on the color of their skin, and within that there were certain prejudices. So yeah, I used a lot of my own growing up and history of our country.
And Rizelle, how did you first get involved with this film?
Oh my gosh, I think I auditioned in 2017 for Judy. It was towards the middle of the year, I think, and I had gone in for the first audition, and then I got a call back, and then I had to do another call back over Skype with Judy, where she just speaks to you, and she's just finding out about everything. And I was set to go in for one more meeting with her. This was towards December, and by December, I got a call from the casting director, and she was like, "You got the job." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, now the real hard work starts," because I think it was daunting for me. It was my first mainstream feature film, and I was so excited to work with Judy because she's absolutely phenomenal. I mean, I've watched her first feature film, Hatchet Hour, and that was brilliant. And I'm like, oh damn it, what do I do? I was so overwhelmed. So yeah, I auditioned in 2017. We filmed in 2018. The film released 2019, and it's done its round around the world.
It's so great. I mean, I would never, I went back, obviously, kind of looked up your past filmography, Rizelle, and was, surprised that this was your first feature film. I don't know, you have this star power, when you see you on screen, particularly at the end, you just that it was great. How was it for you, that being your first feature experience? Was it kind of what you were hoping for?
No, it was my first mainstream South African feature film. I mean, I've done like Scorpion King, that was Universal Studios, but it meant a great deal to me to do something for the first time in my country. And it was absolutely phenomenal to work with Judy. It was so incredible to just be on set, to learn from her, because every time she comes onto set, it's a new learning experience. So apart from Judy and apart from those things, it was really grounding, and I just want to do it again. So we'll see.
And this, you mentioned Judy's first feature, Hatchet Hour. This was obviously a big change in genre from your first feature film, Judy. What made you decide to make more of a kid? I mean, you mentioned obviously it's about you, but knowing this was clearly much more of a sort of family-oriented film, that how was that shift for you in switching to that kind of genre?
It's just so funny because every single film I do seems to be very different from the last one. And I mean, I've just written a drama that's set against a natural disaster. And that's very different from Kings, which is a family film. So I tend to, be drawn to stories that really, if it has a impact on my heart, if I feel there's a little tingle there and it's a story I must tell, and I feel like it's a story that only I can tell, then it doesn't matter the genre, then I feel I must invest myself in it. So yes, Hatchet Hour was, it's a little bit edgier, it's an adult audience. And then, Kings was, when I wrote it, I was not necessarily writing it for children or even a family audience. I was just writing it to be an entertaining, fun piece. I'm the audience for that film, so I was writing it for everyone to enjoy. So, and I wanted to be able to, at the end of writing it, be able to say, I really enjoyed the process. I mean, the writing for me is the most stressful thing because I'm not a natural writer. I'm a director who writes because I have to, or else the film will never get made, or the story will never get told. So so I just kind of wrote from that perspective, from what my gut feel is, and if I can fall in love with a project for as long as it takes, then that's cool by me.
Well, and did you have any, as you said, you wrote it from your experience and from knowing obviously what South Africa was like in the 1980s and the division of the different communities and obviously very racially divided. And I'm not sure, like I know for myself, I don't know how many Americans are aware of the sizable Indian population in South Africa. Can you talk a little bit about that cultural intersection of how the Indian community has grown in South Africa, how it and why you chose to center your film around that particular Sugar Hill district? Is that a real district in the Natal province? Is that someplace that you're super familiar with?
Okay, so firstly, I think at some stage in the last 10 years, at least, the Indian population in South Africa has been the largest population outside of India. And, I'm a third generation Indian. And so, not many people know that about our history, and not many people know, how we speak, what our communities look like, what it was like for us growing up in apartheid South Africa. So I felt it was important to tell that story from that perspective. And then Sugar Hill District, it's a fictionalized name, but all of the locations are actual locations in which Indian communities reside. And even up to today, because apartheid had a huge impact on how people live and where they live, these communities are still largely very Indian communities. They haven't totally integrated as yet. There is some integration, but by and large, not massive. And those rolling hills of sugarcane, those communities of low-cost housing, those are places that started off in the 80s, and they still look the same. The only difference is that you might find a satellite dish. Well, you'll find several satellite dishes, which we had to clean out for the film. But that's kind of the only indication that these communities have moved with the times. And if you saw a person with a cell phone, which luckily we don't have in our film, or a satellite dish, that would give the time period away. But it wasn't a challenge actually achieving that kind of look and feel, because the communities are still very much the way they are. Yeah.
That was going to be my question too, because oftentimes it's very challenging to do a period film of any kind because you have to replicate everything. But when you didn't have to do a lot of, even with the cars, you didn't have to.
We had to source the cars, so those were a little bit challenging for us to do. But we had a great production designer who, yeah, I think he brought cars from Johannesburg. He kind of just did a lot of work, and but the challenge with those cars is they don't start a lot of the times. So we had to have a mechanic on standby on the days that we had these two of the cars were just they'd work perfectly. And then when we call action, that's the time that it wouldn't work.
Of course. And Rizelle, you grew up in Durban, correct? Is that where you're from originally? Yeah. And so I wonder sort of how this was for you as far as, experiencing, I mean, you were probably a little bit younger, but, a child during the apartheid era that this represents, and what it was like for you kind of recreating that time frame.
Yeah, I mean, we had our first democratic election in 1994. That's when I was 3 years old. So I was kind of a new baby in the freedom era. It was a little bit difficult for me, so I had to do my research with a lot of the older generation. My parents' friends, my aunties and uncles, they remember it a lot more than I do. I was brought up in a little bit of privilege in that sense. I could play outside and not be fearful of doing so. So I had to do a lot of research regarding that. But it's amazing. It's really nostalgic to go back to those times, because even if you see toward the end of the movie, you see a yellow police van, and those police vans don't exist anymore. We have white police vans with these blue and neon markings, and that it's period when you see things like that. And it's so nostalgic because it takes you back to a time that sometimes there were good times, but they were also really rough times. Yeah, and I think Judy captured that really well.
So can you, Tiki and Harold, such an awesome combo and such a great contrast to one another. How did you find and select your young actors, and did they have any prior acting experience? I saw at the end, it says introducing, which usually means that it might be their first big roles.
Well, firstly, I have to say I'm incredibly proud of these two boys. It took us 6 months to find them. It was not an easy thing to do. We had to go to a lot of public schools, especially for the Tiki character, because I knew I was never going to find that character in a private school, in the private school system. But I knew I would find Babu in a private school system. So we started off with the private schools first because we knew the parents would bring the kids. There would not be as much convincing to be done. And we found Babu very quickly. We found him, I think, in the first 3 days. But my concern with him was that he was very young. He was 7 years old.
Oh, wow.
He was actually 8 when we shot, but he was 7 when he auditioned. And I just thought, oh my word, this child is too young. And then, there are so many restrictions that come with working with a child like that in terms of time and shooting hours that you have. So I had to consider all of those things. But at the end of the day, I thought, he's so mature and he's a little bit of a crazy kid. So he's very hyper and all over the place. But I thought if I could harness that energy, I think we could get a lot out of him in a short space of time. And my instincts were right, because that's exactly what happened. Because we never did, I think, more than 4 takes with him. But then with the Tiki character, we had to search for this kid. And then eventually, in my hometown, where I was born and raised, we find him in a public school system. He came in, and he's nothing like Tiki. He is totally shy, the most respectful kid. Couldn't say some of the curse words, so he couldn't do that. And his movements, he couldn't dance that well either.
Wow.
And so we had 6 weeks of dance rehearsals, acting rehearsals for both of them. They both never danced or acted before. So these are kids with no acting experience at all. And to be honest, South Africa doesn't have a huge pool of professional kids. Actually, there are none in the Indian community. This is, I think, the start of bringing up child actors in the Indian community. So yeah, Tiki really blossomed, because if you had to meet him now, he's much more confident and much more sure of himself than he was before.
Well, how did they experience seeing themselves on screen for the first time? I mean, because he comes across as, obviously he's trying to be so cool all the time, but he kind of pulls it off. He is really cool.
Well, I think they're too used to seeing themselves, and they become professionals. They know everybody's jobs, so they will advise you on how to cut the film and why they are doing their performance in such a way to make the editor's life easier. But in terms of now, I think they're so used to seeing themselves, and the film's been played so often that it's nothing. It's one of those things. But I think they do enjoy the attention.
Well, and the fact that you said that there really were no child actors in the Indian community in South Africa, did you have any challenges with their parents as far as them, engaging? Because this is a pretty, making a feature film is a pretty rigorous experience, and for them, and particularly also there are elements of danger in the story, and there are guns and they're swearing, and was that ever an issue as far as getting their parents on board?
Not really. Well, I think I was very aware of the challenges. Like when I just finished writing it, I had sent the script to a very well-known South African casting director. And she read the script and she asked me, what's wrong with me? She said, what's wrong with you? You always choose the most difficult stories to tell. She said, we're never going to find these kids here. Prepare yourself, because we might have to go to India. But I was convinced. I knew these kids growing up, and I knew they existed. They just needed some nurturing, and they needed someone to invest time in building them up, So I was not under any illusions about the process and the challenges. And then when I finally met the parents, I took them out for coffee. We sat down, and I first laid out on the table all the challenges that existed in the film for a kid. And they had nothing to compare it with. It's not like they can call somebody and say, what's up? So they had to take my word for it, but I hope that I am a trustworthy person they can believe in. So I think I am, because they did go with me on this journey, and they were totally on board. We had a childminder at all times. And so that became the contact person for the parents. And it also gave them a lot of peace of mind to know that these two boys were being taken care of in a very, good way. So, I think we also got a little bit lucky, because they were not, they're not used to stardom, and they're not used to fame. So they had no preconceived ideas about it. Because I know, like in Hollywood, you've got the star kid moms who demand a lot of things for their kids, and we didn't have those issues.
And Rizelle, how was it for you working with? What was your experience working with these two young actors? Did you sometimes feel like you might get upstaged by them?
Oh, to be so honest with you, they were so delightful. On and off set, so professional for their first time doing a feature or just acting in general. I loved watching them grow, because Sean was 7 when he was cast. He was 8 when we filmed, and now he's gone so big. I see he has braces in his teeth, and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're growing up so fast. I can't deal with this. Like, what's going to happen next? It's such a privilege to watch them grow. It's such a privilege to see how professional they are from such a young age, to see the etiquette that they had on set. It was lovely. I loved being a part of it. never upstage, just being in the presence of wonderful child actors.
And Judy, you mentioned that you based this on your experiences growing up. Were you ever tempted to make these characters girls instead of boys?
You know, I've been asked that question a lot. And even when I was, I think in the early stages of development, when I was writing, I usually used to get this question from men, and I never got it from women. Men used to ask me, "Oh, but why are you making this story? It's a boy's story." And my response used to always be, "So what?" You know, I'm like, I was never going to justify anything to anyone. And so, you know, I said to you that when I was growing up, I never identified with a gender as such. And I think if one had to like classify me based on just behavior, then I would have been a boy. Because that was my behavior was all of, you know, the stuff that boys did is what I found interesting and what I, you know, wanted to do. So I did think about making them girls, and I just didn't feel it was truthful. And I didn't feel it was truthful of the times, because I didn't know, except myself, I didn't know any other girl who was this way, you know? So I didn't feel I could write it like that and still have it be believable to the audience, especially the community that the story is set in. Yeah. So yeah, so I just went with my instincts and what felt natural for the story.
So this film is also such a great tribute to Bollywood films, of course. Have both of you always been a fan of Bollywood films?
Yeah.
You want to go, Rizelle?
Yeah, I mean, I have. Judy, I think more of the former Bollywood films, yeah, the golden oldies and stuff. I'm like 2000s, 90s baby. I'm Shah Rukh Khan, Hrithik Roshan, Aishwarya Rai. That's what I watched growing up. I love talking about growing up as a boy. I used to love watching Hrithik Roshan dance. I used to do all of his dances, and everybody used to ask me, like, why don't you do the girl dances? And I said, because he has better moves. he just did. The boys had the better things. And I loved being that way. And I grew up watching it. And it's been a huge part of my life. And it's shaped and molded me into part of who I am today. So yeah, it's massive.
Well, I can't say I was a huge Bollywood fan. However, around that age, around 9, I think once I hit puberty, because I hit puberty very early, around 10. So up till that age, Bollywood was still part of my life. And there were movies in which I saw representations of Indian women who were fighting, who were cops, who were, you know, doing stunts. Yeah. That I wasn't seeing anywhere else on our television screen or in our cinema. So it drew me in, but it was the most uncool thing. Like, if I watched a Bollywood film, I was not going to go to school and tell people I watched a Bollywood film. That was going to be a secret. But now and again, there would be a Bollywood song that came out that you could not ignore, that was played everywhere, that was like, you know, and then you just get taken in by it. And, you know, I used to play with my cousins, and we used to create these like theater shows for our parents when we had family get-togethers. And we'd always try to take stuff from Bollywood movies and create these little skits for them. So Bollywood was a part of my life, which kind of just faded out as I became a teenager, because it was not cool. And then when I was writing this, that's when I actually got reminded of what an impact it actually did have on my childhood and how it was present. And, you know, it was the days of VHS tapes and projectors, and, you know, and hiring one English movie, one Tamil movie, and one Hindi movie. because that would satisfy the audience at home. Because, my parents would watch a Tamil movie. We were not interested in the Tamil movies. We would watch the Hindi movies, and then the English movie was for everyone. So it took me back to my childhood, and I realized that actually you can't ignore the Bollywood because it was there, and it did have an impact.
Right, it was kind of like your background. And at the very start of the film, you make a point to let the audience know that you're not subtitling the Bollywood songs or filming, or films. Can you talk a little bit about that choice and why you wanted to make sure people were clear about it?
Okay, so when we were growing up, we never had subtitles in South Africa. Whatever content we did get, some of which was dubbed. So you'd watch dubbing films, and then for Indian communities that were the only people watching Bollywood films, mostly, you would get these films and they were never subtitled. So I grew up watching these films with no dubbing and no subtitles in the original language. And there's something that happens to you when you watch a film without knowing the language, because I used to be able to get everything. I got all of the emotions. I understood. By the way, I don't speak any of the Indian languages. And I used to watch this as an English-speaking kid in South Africa. And I totally understood the film. I never felt robbed of not knowing the actual dialogue. And I totally got it. And I thought, you know what, that's the thing that with Bollywood is actually you don't need to, you just need to be present and not be distracted from reading subtitles and just enjoy the film, because you will get it. And I trusted that when people watched this film, they were also going to have the same experience.
So can you talk a little bit about that, the use of language and how it shows up in the film too? Because I think it's also really interesting for, particularly for American audiences to better understand, that Harold and his father only speak, Harold's very clearly only speaks English. But the other members of the community speak, sort of a form of pidgin English. Can you talk about the origin of that language and sort of the combination of languages that are infused in that?
Yeah. So what's very interesting about the language, and it's also quite funny to me because I have no clue how this Indian dialect came about, why there's no sense to it. There's absolutely no reason why we should be speaking with the accent that we do. But it was very, very prominent in the 80s. In the 80s, I think right now, people are more modern. They've had more, exposure to the world. Education has made a big difference. So people don't speak like that as much. But during the 80s, a lot of people spoke that way. And it's a mix of languages. So it's English, but a little bit of African languages thrown in there, and a little bit of Afrikaans thrown in there. And so together, it all becomes this like weird blend of slang. And it's so strange because the film screened at Syndicate in the Netherlands. And we had days where it was packed. We were sold out for all of the days. And people would always ask me about this language because, the Dutch audiences would say, but I understood some of the slang. And I'm like, yes, because it's Afrikaans, and Afrikaans is very close, to what they speak. And so it's a very unique way of speaking. And I don't think the rest of the world has actually heard what a South African Indian in the 80s sounds like. I think it's like the first for people to be introduced to this community.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And just, where it shows up in different places. And just a lot of it, like in the man and the kid, the way that they refer to each other in sort of these slangy terms. It's really funny. But it's just talk about that first moment where Babu was kind of like, I only speak English. And he's like, but everyone's kind of speaking English, but then sort of, but not really.
Yeah.
Fascinating. There's also a lot of moments in the film that illustrate, the class and racial tensions, from the language they speak to the food they eat, the clothes they wear. Can you talk a little bit how you wanted to portray that? Because some of it's very subtle, but some of it's very obvious, but it's everywhere in the film that, that it's kind of the framework that holds up the story, as you were saying before. But, if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, in the 80s, Joburg was the place to be. If you were progressive, if you were educated and you wanted to have a career that paid a lot of money, then you would be in Johannesburg. And Durban was the place you actually moved out of. So the movement back to Durban was very rare. And if people moved back, it was because they had fallen on hard times. And nobody willingly came back. So when Babu and his father come back to Durban, it's because their circumstances have changed. It's not the same anymore. And, they are forced to come back and downgrade their lives, so to speak. So I wanted to make that very clear. And, nobody else has a car. They're like the only ones who have a car in that community. So there are there's subtleties throughout the film about the prejudices that exist within Indian communities. And the one thing that apartheid did is, besides telling people of color that they were inferior, it also separated them. And then within those communities, your complexion, the lightness of your skin, also then became a dividing factor, because if you were light-skinned, you're somehow better than somebody who was darker. And those things exist in the film. And there's a point when the two boys are on the roof and Babu sees his bicycle for the first time after it's been stolen. And he says, "Oh, but she's so fair." Tiki says, "There's Layla with your bike." And he says, "Oh, but she's so fair." And I knew some people it wouldn't get it, or it would just go over some people's head, but then some people would get it because, the notion of color was entrenched in people's minds. And then, it's like those communities, employment was very difficult for people to actually have. And if you had an addiction, to hold on to was even worse. And those things are very real. It was very real then, it's very real now. And so I wanted to make a point of, having those quite prominent in the film.
So can we talk about Raj for a minute, the character, the criminal. In some ways he's, a bit of a cartoonish villain, but in others he's a very real and scary criminal, terrorizing the neighborhood. Was that type of criminal activity common in the area at the time? And how did you try and find that balance between kind of the comedy and the danger of his character?
There are low-cost housing areas throughout Natal, our province. And in these communities, you would always find these guys who think they're the top-notch gangster, when actually they're not. They're just the local street gangster. And they had, in the 80s, they had very specific traits. The gold teeth, the perm hairstyle. There were certain things that they did, like the shirts. He wears these very over-the-top shirts. And so I molded these, from my experience of these people. I think as a child I was very observant, because I used to watch people. People watch a lot, and I used to pick up, especially on the interesting characters. And I found these guys very interesting. The way they walked, the way they spoke, and the things they did. And they could also be the kindest people when they want to be. That was the weirdest thing. So when I was casting that role, the actor I cast is actually from one of these areas and knows this world thoroughly. Actually, he didn't have to do much acting because he knows this world, and he could switch it on like if I asked him to connect with a certain thought or a certain kind of emotion, he was able to do it because he's so familiar with it. And he speaks like the world because he belongs to that world, you know, so he speaks like that. So it was not a stretch for him. However, he had to invest quite a lot in trying to be a mean guy, especially to kids. It's not a pleasant thing for somebody to do. And I think he tackled that very well. He was able to do it in such a way that it was not traumatizing for any of the children.
So on a different topic, Rizelle, I'm wondering how challenging was it for you to play an extremely pregnant character for the entire film? And extra weight with you for everything.
So what it was is I had sort of a prosthetic that was always tied to me. It was a real weight, so it wasn't. I wasn't imagining that it was that heavy. It was that heavy. So every time we had a break or we're not shooting, I had to sleep upright. There were bean bags on at base for the kids, and I used to sort of steal their places because I couldn't sit up on a chair, because it really does do a lot to your insides, and especially if you're drinking lots of water on set, it's going to do something to you. Apart from the prosthetics and apart from the physicality of it, I think just the mind of her. You had to get into the mind of her. You had to get into the mind of a tenacious character, but also a tenacious character who's pregnant and heavily annoyed often. I don't think that was hard. I have a few nieces. They're around somewhere, and I mean, it wasn't challenging, but I think the most challenging thing was the physicality of it. The mindset of getting into the character was fine for me. Being pregnant was fine for me. It just sort of fits. The puzzle pieces fit together, and it just came together. It was seamless when it was time for us to shoot. I was also trying to make Judy's life as easy as anything, so I wanted to be prepared.
Figuring that she has enough on her plate working with children. It's always challenging.
Yeah.
But I also have loved the music in this film too. So much incredible energy that it brings to everything. Can you talk about how you scored the film and how it helped drive the pace and the tone of the story and your filmmaking? Because I feel like it really drove the whole energy of everything.
Well, South African budgets are not big. We have really small budgets. I mean, our small budget film would be like a micro budget film in the US. So a lot of the music I wanted to get, music from the 80s, I couldn't afford to get it. So I had to come up with creative solutions on how we spend that money and what we can get. So we made very specific choices. If we were going to go after a music track, we must be able to exploit it fully in the film. And so the track where Babu is dancing at the wedding and he gets caught, that was where I decided to put the money in getting that actual track, because it's a homage to, I felt, to the 80s, but also to the actress who plays the dancer in that song. And she passed away last year, I think. And she was such an icon of Bollywood. I thought we cannot not have that track. So, we made specific choices on, I think it was that, and then the scene where Amitabh Bachchan dies on screen and Tiki is very emotional. I thought those were two iconic things that we had to get. And then obviously the opening footage where we've got Rajinikanth fighting those fight sequences. And I thought, so we were very specific, and we chose, and I had to do a lot of research and watch a lot of films prior, and I also had to watch have many options, because one could easily not happen. So I needed to make sure that the film would still work no matter which one we got. But then when it came to the score, we had a composer in South Africa, And I just I gave him references of what I wanted. And then the tracks would always come back, but not feel quite there. And then there was a piece of Kathak music, the track where Rizelle is so stunning and performance at the end. We threw in a piece of Kathak music in towards the end bit, and that just for me made it. So I think I knew exactly what I wanted. And Brendan Jury, who was the composer, was great because we would always do some samples of stuff, and then he would send it to me, and I would say yes or no, you're totally on the wrong track, or you keep going. So we had it didn't feel so challenging. It was a bit challenging when we got into sound editing because there was a lot of times where we needed the music to drive, and I think we were a little bit short on the music, but then we always made a plan.
Well, and then of course there's that final dance scene, which just looks like everyone is having such a great time. Was that always part of the script, and also did you model it after any particular Bollywood dancing?
I think it's a combination of a lot of Bollywood stuff. I think I took everything that inspired me and tried to put it in one track. It was a lot of fun. It was very stressful because we shot all of that in one night. And we started late afternoon, and I think we finished at 2 a.m. in the morning. And luckily, we had the support of the community, who all came out to cheer us when we needed them to be quiet. They were quiet, and when we needed them to clap and applaud, that happened. But it was a lot of fun. It was for me very stressful because I knew the amount of stuff I needed to get in order to have something that worked. That was pacey, that kind of just happened, but still had the humor of the film and still had the boys, giving up a performance. Having a kid at 2 a.m. trying to give a performance is a bit of a challenge, especially when they want to sleep. But having the adult actors break it up, because I knew I could rely on them. And that was like my one big note to them was, listen, I've not worked with kids before, and this is my first time. I want to be able to put my energy into these kids who have never done this. So I expect you to come prepared. So that was my big note for them. And thankfully, they all did. They all rose to the challenge, and everyone, arrived on set ready to, rock and roll.
It was really great. It was such a great ending. It just, you leave with a huge smile on your face. And speaking of which, our time is pretty much run out, but it was such a pleasure speaking to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again for this great film. We're really, really thrilled to be able to share with our audiences. And
thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
We hope your audience enjoys our film.
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for watching and enjoying.